U.S. president's political opponents are already vowing to prevent the White House from implementing the changes in U.S. Cuba policy. For more on the fight emerging between the Obama administration and some of those lawmakers, we turn to CCTV's Nathan King, who joins us now from the newsroom with more.
Yeah, Mike, some of those senators and lawmakers reflect the older people in that poll that we have, including lawmakers from Florida and those of Cuban descent. And they got angrier Thursday when the White House did not rule out the possibility of a visit to the U.S. by Cuban President Raul Castro. And the State Department also says that restoring relations with Cuba is unlikely to be tied to the issue of human rights.
The implications of this decision will extend far beyond just Cuba. It has a chilling effect on democracy and freedom in the region, and on those in the region who are bravely fighting for it, especially those in Cuba.
Opponents to a rekindled relationship between Washington and Havana are quick to remind the White House that the U.S. Congress ultimately has the authority to lift the trade embargo against Cuba, and there are 6 separate laws responsible for the sanctions. There are a number of actions the U.S. Congress could take, including barring funds for the establishment of an embassy and staff in Cuba. They could refuse to confirm any potential ambassador to Cuba, and they could maintain the travel and trade embargo until congressional demands on Cuba are met. And much of the embargo legislation requires that no Castro is empowering Cuba when an embargo is lifted, and that Cuba takes steps to democratize. But many Cuba experts recognize the U.S. president has broad discretion in implementing the policy, and by embracing Cuba in this way, they say, he is reducing the influence of Cuban Americans who used to hold the balance of power over politics in Florida and beyond.
They basically held Florida hostage and saying that if you don't go with the embargo and with our point of view on Cuba, Florida will vote against you, is now solved.
You know, Mike, there's also this Castro factor going on here in Washington. Many lawmakers and politicians feel after 50 years, the Castros have sort of won here, that their system of government remains intact. U.S. presidents have wrestled with Cuban policy over the years and come and gone, but the Castros have remained, and that can't be underestimated considering the history between the two countries.
Well, they've certainly outlived a lot of administrations.
Exactly.
Cuba has not really been the focus, though, of U.S. policy in recent years compared in the period during the Cold War. I mean, the last time we were really on headlines, Elian Gonzalez, that was back in the 90s. Do you think that made the deal more likely?
You know, it's funny because a lot of people have said that. You know, there were young people negotiating this deal on behalf of the Obama administration, including Ben Rhodes, a 30-something speechwriter who's now part of the National Security Council. And the older you are, generally, as our CCTV poll showed, the more entrenched your values here as an American are to Cuba. You know, if you are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, where everyone had to duck and cover and worry about the prospect of thermonuclear war, then you are less likely to accept the sea change in U.S. Cuba policy. But if you've never been to Cuba, don't know what it's like, and never saw it as a threat, you're much more likely to embrace the changes, as our poll showed. So it's going to be a fascinating time in American politics when it comes to Cuba. And it's going to be interesting if it opens up and there's more trade back and forth. Will it actually matter? Will it actually cease to matter as much to the American psyche?
Good question. We'll have to wait for the answer. Nathan King, live from our newsroom.
Thank you.